My brother walked into the hospital board hearing wearing his white coat. Surgeons don't wear their white coats to administrative hearings. I registered it immediately as a costume. A prop. He had thought every detail through. I sat at the opposite end of the conference table, with my hands flat on the polished mahogany, and said nothing. The board chair, Ms. Tanaka, was a woman in her 60s with wire-rimmed glasses, and the composed, unhurried expression of someone who had reviewed 1,000 HR complaints and could sense a manufactured one from across the room. She listened to my brother's entire testimony without blinking. Then she reached for the second folder, the one my attorney had placed on the table 40 minutes earlier, and she opened it. The color left her face the way water leaves a bathtub, all at once. Complete. She pressed one palm flat against the table to steady herself, looked up at my attorney, and said she needed a brief recess. She walked out of the room without once looking at my brother. He watched her go. He smiled, just barely, and smoothed his lapel. He thought he had just won. He had no idea the floor had already been removed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Federal Express. White envelope with the Oregon State Board of Nursing seal in the upper left corner. I was standing in my apartment, still wearing scrubs from a night shift, on my second cup of coffee. I put the cup down before I finished the first paragraph. My brother Heath had filed a formal complaint against my nursing license. He claimed I had falsified documentation in 3 separate patient charts over a 14-month period, fabricating procedural notes to conceal errors in post-surgical care on a unit where I had worked until 8 months ago. The language was specific, clinical, and entirely invented. The complaint requested an emergency suspension pending investigation. Beneath Heath's signature were 2 supporting affidavits. My father Martin, a retired cardiologist and founding partner of a cardiology group in Lake Oswego, had provided a sworn statement. My mother Joan had co-signed. I read the whole thing twice. Then I put on a clean sweater and drove 40 minutes to my parents' house. My mother was in the garden when I pulled in, clipping roses with the same deliberate focus she applied to everything. Steady, unhurried, fundamentally uninterested in anything she hadn't already decided mattered. She saw me coming up the path, set down the shears, and touched her hair. A small preparatory gesture. I dropped the letter on the garden table between us. She looked at it. She didn't look at me. "We're doing this because we're worried about you," she said. "Heath says the stress has been affecting your judgment for months. We're stepping in before something worse happens." I said, "You signed a sworn affidavit claiming I committed patient fraud." She picked up her shears. "You have always been so dramatic." My father appeared at the sliding glass door. He was still physically imposing at 71, tall, straight-spined, the kind of man who had spent 50 years having his opinions treated as medical fact. He stepped onto the patio and looked at the letter on the table, with the practiced disinterest of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "The quiet exit is still available," he said. "Resign from the hospital system. No one needs to know anything beyond that. Heath is doing critical work on the new surgical wing. His reputation cannot be tied to whatever has been happening on your unit." I looked at my father, I looked at my mother, then I walked back to my car. I let myself cry for 8 minutes on the freeway on-ramp. Exactly 8. Then I called the one person I knew who could help me understand what I was actually dealing with. Her name was Rosario, and she had spent 18 years as a hospital compliance auditor before going private. We had met through a mutual colleague, and I had trusted her instincts from the first conversation. She agreed to meet me that evening, at a coffee shop in southeast Portland with exposed brick walls and a chalkboard menu. The kind of place where no one cares about the people around them. She arrived already holding a folder. "I started pulling when you called this afternoon," she said, sitting down across from me, "because the timing of this complaint is not a coincidence." She laid it out methodically. The hospital system where Heath operated was scheduled for a Medicare billing audit in 3 weeks. The audit had been triggered by a flagged anomaly, a pattern of post-surgical procedure codes, billed to Medicare that didn't align with the corresponding anesthesia logs. Over a 22-month period, approximately $340,000 in procedures had been billed that either hadn't occurred, or had been coded at significantly higher complexity levels than the actual surgeries performed. Every one of those procedures had been performed by Heath. The auditors had not yet linked the billing pattern to his name, but they were close. If they pulled his patient files, they would find the codes. If they found the codes, they would trace the supporting documentation, and that documentation included post-surgical care notes, notes from the floor where I had worked, notes with my signature. "He needs someone to have already tampered with records on that unit," Rosario said quietly. "If your license is under investigation for chart manipulation, it creates doubt about the integrity of the entire unit's documentation. His attorneys could argue the irregularities aren't his fraud, they're your negligence. The audit gets complicated. He buys time. Maybe enough time to restructure the billing retroactively." I sat with that for a moment. He was going to use my career as a firewall between himself and a federal fraud investigation. Rosario stood up and zipped her bag. "I'll keep pulling, but understand, someone inside that hospital helped him access your old chart entries. This wasn't done alone. She paused at the edge of the table. Document everything from this point forward. Don't contact your brother. Keep your phone charged. She walked out into the Portland rain, and I sat alone with a lukewarm cup of tea, and stared at the chalk menu on the wall without reading a word of it. A memory arrived the way those memories always do. Without permission, without warning, landing with its full weight. My nursing school pinning ceremony, 14 years ago. I had mailed my parents the invitation 6 weeks in advance. I had left 2 voicemails. I had sent a card with the date printed at the top in large, unambiguous numbers. My mother called the morning of the ceremony to say my father had clinic hours he couldn't rearrange. She had a luncheon. I remembered being 17. In the back seat of my father's car, on the way home from a restaurant, when he told me in his flat, diagnostic voice, that nursing was what people pursued when they weren't academically equipped for medical school. He said it without particular cruelty, as simple fact, the way he stated a patient's cholesterol number or the time of a procedure. I got into nursing school 2 years later on a merit scholarship, and told him at dinner. He finished chewing before he answered. Well, he said, I suppose you've made your decision. I sat in that coffee shop for another 20 minutes. Then the memory went cold and became something harder and more useful. I picked up my phone and called my attorney. The board hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in October. The room was windowless. I hadn't expected that, and the fluorescent overhead lighting gave everything a faintly punitive quality, like an environment designed to make you feel exposed. Heath arrived with 2 attorneys from a downtown firm. My parents sat in the gallery behind him, my father in a charcoal suit, my mother in a cream blouse with a single strand of pearls. They had dressed as if attending a charitable function. Something civic and mildly obligatory. Heath presented his complaint with the practiced, measured authority of someone who had delivered thousands of clinical briefings. He cited specific chart entries by date. He constructed a timeline. He described me with careful, sorrowful language as a nurse who had been deteriorating under professional pressure for over a year, who had covered clinical errors with falsified documentation, who had potentially endangered patients on a unit where he had operated regularly. His voice held exactly the right amount of reluctance. The reluctance of a man doing something difficult because he had no other choice. He was very good. I had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, how good he was at performing sincerity. My parents were called to make their statements. My father testified that as a physician, he had personal concerns about my clinical judgment going back nearly a year, and he referenced a dinner conversation during which I had allegedly expressed doubts about my ability to manage complex post-surgical cases. The dinner he described had never taken place. Not one detail of it was real. He delivered it calmly, under oath, with the authority of a man who had spent his entire career being believed. My mother pressed a folded tissue to the corner of one dry eye and spoke about how painful this decision had been, how many sleepless nights she and my father had spent wrestling with it, how deeply she loved me, and how in the end, the safety of patients had to come first. Her voice broke in exactly the right place. I let them speak. I let every word go into the official record without interruption. When my parents finished, Miss Tanaka made careful notes, asked 2 clarifying questions in a tone that revealed nothing, and then reached for the second folder. The one my attorney had placed at her end of the table that morning. She opened it. What Rosario had built over 3 weeks was not flashy. It was methodical, legitimate, and airtight. She had obtained, through entirely proper channels, the digital access logs from the hospital's electronic health record system. Logs that timestamped every chart access, every modification, every export, tied to individual employee badge credentials and IP addresses. The chart entries Heath had cited as evidence of my falsification had been accessed and altered after I had already transferred off that unit. I had not had active system credentials for those records for 7 months, at the time of the supposed modifications. More critically, the attestation form certifying the accuracy of the modified entries, the document that carried a co-signature validating the changes, bore the name of a charge nurse who had retired and relocated to New Mexico, 14 months before the date printed on the form. Someone had signed her name to a document after she was already gone. And the access logs placed the terminal used to make those modifications in the surgical administrative corridor. Heath's corridor. During hours when his badge had swiped into that wing. Miss Tanaka read through the folder. She turned a page. She turned another. She went very still in the way that people go still when they realize the situation in front of them is significantly different from the one they were told to expect. Then she stood up and said she needed a brief recess, and she left the room, taking the folder with her, without looking at Heath once. 11 minutes. I counted them. When she returned, she had brought 2 other board members, and all 3 of them had the expression of people who had just been handed a problem no one had prepared them for. She set the folder on the table. She looked at Heath. She informed him, in the precisely neutral language of institutional authority, that the attestation document he had submitted contained a co-signature from a licensed nurse whose credentials, according to the Oregon Board of Nursing's own records, had been formally surrendered 14 months prior to the date appearing on the form. She asked whether he had any information about how that signature had come to appear on a document dated well after the signatory had left both the hospital and the state. Heath looked at the folder. He said there must be a clerical error somewhere in the records. My attorney stood up. She placed Rosario's access log analysis on the table. She placed the hospital's badge entry records for the surgical administrative corridor alongside a timestamp comparison, mapping the chart modifications to the precise window during which Heath's badge had registered in that wing. Then she said, in a voice calibrated to the specific quietness that makes rooms go completely silent, that if the board wished to verify the data through independent channels, she was prepared to formally request a subpoena for the hospital's server backup logs, which would provide irrefutable confirmation of which individual credential set had been used to access and alter the records in question. Heath's hands went to the podium. His knuckles turned white. And then something happened that I had not anticipated, even knowing what I knew. The composure that had held for 40 minutes simply stopped. Not gradually, all at once. His voice lost its steadiness. He started talking too fast, his sentences running into each other, and he said his hospital ID account had been showing unusual activity. He had meant to report it. He had been meaning to look into it. And then he turned toward the gallery, where my parents were sitting, and something in his face went open, and young, and frightened in a way I hadn't seen since we were children. He said they had told him the documentation was solid. He said they had told him it would work. My mother looked at the ceiling. My father picked up his water glass. Miss Tanaka asked the security officer stationed at the door to please contact the hospital's compliance office. She informed Heath's attorneys that she would be referring the matter to the Oregon Medical Board and the State Attorney General's office for investigation into the submission of fraudulent evidence to a licensing tribunal. She directed that Heath's hospital credentials be suspended immediately and his access credentials flagged pending investigation. The security officer stepped forward and asked Heath to please come with her. He walked out of the room between two people in lanyards, his white coat still on, and I thought about all the years I had watched him walk out of every situation completely untouched, and the feeling I had right then was not triumph. It was quieter than triumph. It felt more like watching a clock finally show the correct time after running wrong for as long as I could remember. I stood up, put on my coat, and placed the no-contact order on the table, in front of my parents without saying a word. I had signed it that morning. I set it down without meeting either of their eyes, and I walked out of the building. 4 days later, my phone showed a text from an unknown number. Heath was out on bail. My father had put up the deed to a commercial property he owned in Beaverton to secure his release. The text informed me that his legal team had multiple avenues of challenge, that civil discovery proceedings alone would consume years of my professional life, and that I had made an enormous miscalculation by not accepting the quiet exit when it had been offered. I read it once. I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. Then I did something I had learned from Rosario during one of our late-night calls. I built a trap out of his own nature. The conditions of Heath's bail included a strict prohibition against contacting potential witnesses, accessing hospital record systems, or communicating electronically with any party involved in the board investigation. Standard language. His attorneys had signed off on every line. I knew Heath. 31 years of knowing someone gives you a particular kind of knowledge, not affectionate, just accurate. The one thing he could not tolerate was losing control of an outcome. He needed to intervene. He needed to manage. Sitting in my parents' guest room while an audit dismantled his billing history would have been a form of psychological torture for him. So my attorney drafted a document designed to look like an internal compliance memo from the hospital. No false information in it, just a visible summary of the audit timeline written in the hospital's standard formatting and font. My attorney sent it to my mother's email address. Heath was staying in that house. He had access to everything that came through it. The document contained a tracking pixel. When the email was opened and the attached file was accessed, it logged the device, the network, and the timestamp. The email was opened at 11:52 p.m. 3 days later. The device was a tablet registered to my mother. The IP address resolved to my parents' home network. The attached memo was then forwarded from that device to an external email account that Rosario traced in under an hour to a server handle, built around a variation of Heath's middle name. He had opened it. He had forwarded it. He had done both from his mother's device to conceal himself, in direct violation of the explicit electronic communication prohibition attached to his bail. The district attorney's office described it later as attempted unauthorized access of case-sensitive documentation. Bail was revoked within 24 hours. This time there was no property available. My father had already committed everything on the first bond. The deputies arrived at my parents' house at 7 in the morning. My father was in the kitchen. My mother was still upstairs. Heath came down in clothes he had apparently slept in. I was told later by someone who had no particular reason to tell me, but did. When the deputies came, my father didn't argue. He didn't reach for his phone. He looked at Heath standing in the kitchen doorway, and said, in the flat clinical tone he had used for every significant statement of his life, that he was not going to lose the practice over Heath's mistakes. He told the deputies that he would cooperate fully with anything they needed from him regarding Heath's activities in the house. He said this while Heath was standing 4 feet away from him. Heath said his name. He said it twice. My father walked back to his coffee. They took Heath out for the second time. No one posted bail this time. There was nothing left to post. People ask me, sometimes, how I managed to sit in that room for 2 hours while my parents testified against me under oath and never say a word. They want to know if some part of me, even at the very end, still hoped they would choose differently. The honest answer is that I had stopped hoping for a different family well before that Thursday morning. I had stopped the night I sat in a coffee shop in the rain, and understood that my brother had made a calculation. Cold, deliberate, specific, that the most useful thing my career could be to him was wreckage. That my life's work was, to the people who had watched me build it, a convenient sacrifice, not a difficult choice, a practical one. Grief, once it finishes completing itself, stops feeling like grief. It starts feeling like visibility, like finally being able to see a room clearly, because the furniture that was blocking the windows has been removed. I went back to work. I took a Friday shift 2 weeks after the hearing and stood at a patient's bedside, explaining a post-surgical breathing exercise for the 3rd time, slowly without impatience, until the patient felt confident enough to try it independently. That is the work. That is what the work has always been, underneath everything else. The people who had quietly held things together for me during those months, the colleague who had first connected me to Rosario, the nurse manager, who had flagged inconsistencies in those altered charts 8 months before the complaint was ever filed, the attending physician who wrote an unsolicited character statement for my file without being asked. These people gave me something my family never had and never would. Not obligation, not management. Just steadiness, freely offered. I deleted my parents' contact information. I didn't send a note explaining. I didn't provide a summary or a final statement. I removed the number, the email, the address, the entire thread of messages going back 15 years. I did it on a Wednesday afternoon while the rain came down outside my apartment window, and then I made dinner. 3 things became clear to me in the months that followed, and I want to say them plainly because I think they matter more than the story itself. The first is that family is not a status. It is a practice. It is what people do consistently over time, when there is nothing to gain from doing it. My brother was the golden child, not because my parents loved him more than they loved me, but because he served a function. He was the family's public-facing proof of itself, the credential they showed to the world. The moment he became a liability that threatened my father's practice, he was handed over to deputies in a kitchen, without a second's hesitation. That is not love. That is portfolio management. You cannot build a life on the approval of people who are only capable of approving you, while you remain useful to them. The second is that silence is not passivity. Every instinct I had during that board hearing told me to stand up, to correct the record out loud, to make my parents hear their own lies named back to them. Every one of those instincts would have been wrong. The most powerful position you can occupy against someone who has already manufactured your destruction is to let them finish building it. Let them testify. Let them sign their names under oath. Let the official record capture every single word in exact sequence. Documents do not forget. Documents cannot be charmed or reframed or denied after the fact. I did not win that hearing by being louder. I won it by being quieter, and more prepared, and by starting long before they knew there was anything to prepare for. The third is the one I want to land most carefully. The goal is not to win. The goal is to get out. Winning suggests there was a game worth playing, that the people across the table were capable of acknowledging a fair outcome. They aren't. People who build their sense of power by reducing yours do not experience your victory as justice. They experience it as an offense, and they immediately begin planning the next move. The only exit that actually ends is the one where you become unreachable. No reaction available to collect. No guilt accessible to reopen. No wound they can find the edge of anymore. You build your life far enough from theirs that their noise cannot reach the address, and then you keep living, and eventually, not quickly, but eventually, the noise stops. I don't know the full shape of what happened to Heath after. I know there were charges. I know the Medicare audit produced findings consistent with what Rosario had estimated on that first night over cold tea. I know that my parents still live in the same house in Lake Oswego, because the no-contact order includes an address. I know that on a Saturday morning in January, 5 months after the hearing, I took a long walk along the waterfront in a light cold rain, and at some point during that walk I realized I was not thinking about any of them. I was not running scenarios. I was not rehearsing defenses. I was not waiting for the next move. I was just walking beside the river while the city went about its morning. That silence, the real one, the interior one, the kind that means no one has access to you anymore, is the thing they were never going to allow you to have while they still had a key. Take a hard look at whoever you are still trying to prove yourself to right now. Ask yourself honestly, has their approval ever actually made you feel safe? Or have you been running a race with a finish line that keeps moving? Tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know.